So as I've been playing this, I've been kind of saying to myself, gosh, something seems kind of weird, especially about Foggia. Sorry, Foggia, I'm told it's pronounced. And I wouldn't know, but I should have known it sure the hell ain't Foggia, because that sound isn't in the Italian G. But there's a couple of options, but I kind of like Foggia, so I probably would have kept saying it, even knowing better. Anyway, as I was playing, I kind of ran into this. There's a lot of things that seem to be wrong, among them this idea that this is all that matters for the victory at the end of the game. Well, turns out I had a little bit of a... I got a response from the game designer to my video. And maybe if I had read the questions and answers carefully, but again, it's 5 pages, added to. It's basically all the new stuff from here rewritten as far as I can tell. And I just kind of guessed that, yeah, I'll understand what's going on. Well, there was something key that I did not get, which is the victory point chart apparently somehow applies to all scenarios. Okay? In particular, it applies to the campaign scenario. We're having some back and forth about whether points are replacements or not, and some other things. But, which means you can exit Allied regiments and battalions. Now, there are no rules for how to do this, that I can find at least, until you get to the optional scenarios, which also give victory points that are a little different. And this is the scenario that really kind of explains anything about exiting. It doesn't really tell you that you can, but it implies that with exiting the northern map. Okay, well, that seems to say maybe you could book from before, but there isn't anywhere in the rules where it describes it. They may not return to the map for any reason. That's boilerplate basic rules for exiting the map. If you're going to state those should be stated wherever the exiting the map rules are. So this is an additional hint that, my scanning through a complete repeat of the standard rules with additional stuff basically written into them for some reason, indeed wouldn't find that, because this does seem to be the basic rules of it. Transit track 1 may not be used. That sounds like it's probably a rule for all the scenarios, but again, there are no rules for exiting the map that I could find for the campaign game. So had this not been here with these basic rules in a specific scenario, I would have noticed this and said, well, what's up with that shit? And probably made up rules that I could exit from the north edge of the map and score points for that. And that, of course, changes the whole game, because the Germans end up defending a line here, a lot of good terrain there. I don't see how they could possibly do it. But, I mean, I really was able to beat up the Germans. But, okay, maybe they can pull back and hold the line there, and it becomes a very different game. It doesn't become a game of, okay, well, let's chase them to that map B over there so they can attack Foggia. And that's a big deal, because like I said, the rules that I was playing under, my understanding of the game, without any ability to exit the map, because there are no rules on that, which you could kind of argue anyway. If there are no rules to exit the map and there's victory points for it, they don't apply because you can't actually do it. But I'm not trying to pick nits like that. I mean, I'm doing that with the designer just because I feel like, I mean, the only thing I'm saying here is I have an excuse for my mistake. But anyway, it did feel like a very, very weird game. But the only reason that the Germans could lose the game based on the victory points on the map is by losing units, because they're not allowed to leave the map. So, you know, something felt very odd about it. It wasn't, as we were collapsing into here, it wasn't feeling like it was historically accurate anymore. The original withdrawals felt reasonable, but if I've got to defend a line and not let the Allies north in Italy, well, obviously. Now, there's a number of reasons, again, that I can excuse this. One is the rule there. Another is the rules for capture of Foggia are here. The victory points that are assigned, they're not the same as the victory points that are assigned here, which are 5 to 15. But there's no rules for determining what that 5 to 15 is. And again, you know, I'm sure this was not intended to confuse me by any means. It's just there's a certain amount of sloppiness that I get the feeling that whatever playtesting was done was probably too aligned with the designer answering questions, people playing it, making sure the game played okay, and not worrying about making sure the rules read well. You know, you need blind testing for that. You can't have the designer or the developer holding your hand while you're playing it and answering your rules questions, because those rules questions go away, right? And you certainly can't have, you know, someone who knows the game teaching it and nobody looking at the rules. And there's an issue with that. Now, blind testing is hard to get people for, maybe. I know when I did a round of it for Toulon at, you know, in the situation of Consim Expo, we had the designer right there, but he was taking notes live from our questions, you know, which is probably the best possible way to do this, because it's not just the players trying to remember, what couldn't we figure out? What just didn't make sense? There still should probably be a layer of that, but, you know, everybody was kind of like, I don't know if I want to read the rules, you know. Just explain it to us. We're at a con. We're having fun, but it was pretty cool. Anyway, here's the thing. Whatever I get out of this at this point, and I'm like, you know, I'm a little over halfway through the game, but whatever I get out of it is sort of meaningless. This is not a viable, the victory points as they stand are not a viable situation, and they're not what the designer intended. Now, I was going to harsh on the fact that they're presenting, you know, a situation that didn't make sense, and obviously that's not what was intended. It was intended to be able to press north, and that probably makes a whole lot more sense. And I probably would have said something like, it's a shame I played the historical campaign and not one of these scenarios that specifies very different kinds of victory conditions, and we could have seen a very different type of game. So what I'm looking at here is, we're not going to get anything meaningful. If you're playing the game right, you will never see this. If you're interested in the historical campaign, this doesn't align with it at all. And, you know, it's not terribly interesting either. In part because it's just hard to believe what, you know, the Axis has to do for this scenario. That said, I don't want to clean it up and restart it. Not even with one of the other scenarios. I've put enough into the Victory in the West series, and then this game, I was expecting this to be developed enough and produced enough to be able to go. So we're going to call it here, and then the rest of this video is going to be the review section. And this is all very weird and different from anything else I've done, I think. I've done somewhere I did the you know, like quit, wrap, and review or whatever, because I only played for a couple of minutes. And it's kind of like that, but it's like, I don't know what else to do. I don't have the time to explore the game more fully at this point, and I just don't have the inclination to do it. I'm going to push on to something else. I think you've gotten to see some of the mechanisms in play, and I think I have some interesting things to say. So Onward. And so sadly, our exploration of Salerno, which was to be the start of a new series, has come to an end. And an abortive and early end. The reason being that, well, the primary reason, I would say, is poorly constructed and developed rules, in the sense that they aren't written to be usable. There's a playable game under there, but the design and the development work that should have gone into this before somebody spent the money on making, a pretty production of a game and boxing it out and selling it to people, and potentially ruining, or perhaps actually ruining, because I didn't see any other games that are actually listed as part of the VCS. Even though there may be games that use the similar rules, the designer seems to indicate he's made at least one other game with these kind of rules. And there's another one on the books, or on the burner. You release something that's this flawed, and that it's essentially unplayable out of the box, I would say. And that's going to hurt the brand overall. It's going to turn off people. But perhaps the bright side of it is it must have been such a poor seller, although that doesn't speak well for the brand, that, it was overproduced or something in terms of the number of copies made, that MMP had to put it on sale. Now, they always put their games on sale, unless they sell out completely pretty early. But all the same, this sat around for enough time that I think it was on multiple sales. And I eventually just decided, fine, I'm going to pull the trigger on it. I like the Victory in the West system well enough that I'm curious to see, how modern principles have influenced it, what kind of improvements could be made to it, whatever. Largely, I found that the improvements to the core system don't really add a whole hell of a lot in and of themselves, from what I can tell. What does add a lot is the choice of scale. The designer made a choice of scale that means that you cannot well, this may be an impact of the scenario I played, but it means that it's much, much harder to just create a wall and say, nope, you're not getting through. Now, the funny thing is, the actual scenario victory conditions that I did not play, because the rules don't express them, in my opinion, accurately, allow for the Allies to get a significant amount of victory points by exiting the north side of the map. And there's a fair amount of north side of the map. I'm not sure the Germans could coat the whole thing with a solid line, and I'm pretty sure they couldn't hold it with a solid line. What that means is they kind of have to conduct a mobile defense, or else there is going to be a path off the north of the map, and the Allies can accumulate quite a few victory points by just exiting units that are in supply off the map. And if it's done early enough, the Germans have to match it with their own units, which they don't get victory points for, but they also don't lose them for losing the units. So, to that extent, I think, what I'm looking at, maybe I'm looking at emergent realities that came from trying to defend a much larger area of the map on the German withdrawal, rather than, at least at first, and it felt very interesting, and it felt very OCS-like, actually, and not very Victory in the West-like. I'm not sure that that would still proceed that way if you're trying to defend a solid line on map A. Some of the things that were added to the game, to the basic rules of the game, you know, the idea of specific engineer units which aid in crossing rivers, building entrenchment lines, stuff like that. Well, again, the entrenchments, that's based on my victory conditions. If the Germans have a little bit of time to build a line and they're trying to defend that entire north edge of the map, yeah, maybe they would have time to dig in again. You know, I didn't feel like I had that kind of time. But the specific engineer units for river crossings, that replaced what was really an abstracted functionality that was available in the original system. And I gotta say, if you're digging entrenchments and putting entrenchment counters, do you really need to specify that the engineering component is there? Yeah, maybe. There may be conditions that can't really be expressed within the game because somebody's cut off, doesn't have an easy way to get the engineer from one section that you're defending to another. But for the most part, I think in this design, and given that you're trying to guard the entire northern edge of the map, you probably will have back areas that you can move your engineers through for that part of the game. So again, I would kind of say, yeah, let's just abstract those away. And then there's a few things that are, you know, additional chrome on what was already a system that tended to carry a little too much chrome. At least by the Sicily game, I felt like it was getting a little too heavy and a little too bloated. Well, this takes the Sicily game and adds a little bit more to it. And I don't think that that's where what I saw as really neat about the game emerged from. I think that was due to the game scale, and that may be something that goes away. You may need a mobile defense. I was feeling like that's what I needed, but if you're ending up going to a static defense line, well, then there goes the one thing that, you know, really kind of impressed me, was that it seemed like the scale and the scope of the game required that if you wanted to stop the Allies effectively, you had to play a more mobile defense. That may be wrong, because all the scenarios appear to be about breaking through the German line and getting to the north, even though the campaign doesn't have any rules supporting that. The only thing it has is a line in the victory point chart, and some of the regular scenarios have rules on how to do it. The other thing that really kind of didn't work for me was the transit tracks. I mean, they do exist and kind of... They don't break the game. They don't make it an unplayable game. But it felt like the abstraction that's present there created unreasonable and unbelievable circumstances where the story that emerged because of them just couldn't be accepted, you know? Anyway, that's about where I am on the game. I think there were some interesting things to it, but component-wise, the map is very, very pretty. It's also hard to read, and there's a trade-off there, you know. I certainly found the hard-to-read portion of it, and by hard-to-read, I mean terrain levels aren't kind of easily distinguishable colors. There's a color shading difference in them, but you're basically working off of these little triangle numbers. There, it doesn't look too bad. But when you start getting to the heavy terrain, it's up here and everything, it's really hard to determine what level terrain you're in. And that's an important consideration for movement and combat in this game. The counters, there are counters that I couldn't find any use for. There. But that's kind of the scenario rules and the units coming in, and maybe, you know, maybe they're handled in some of the other scenarios that I didn't play, and I just didn't see them, and didn't look for them hard enough. One thing that's kind of painful about these suckers, well, first of all, there's some information that's not on the counters that would be helpful in play. For example, the unit size for, like tank units and stuff. That's just not present there. But another thing that's missing is designations on the back of the counters, I think. Yeah, the unit designation isn't on the back of the cadre, but it isn't. It also disappears from some of the other units, and that's important when you're building up units at the beginning of the game after the initial invasion, when you're trying to keep units physically co-located so that they can build the larger regiment units. And they have to be within a certain range of each other to do so. And if the unit's taken a step loss, it no longer has its designation, so you have no idea where it goes. There were a number of things that were not clearly explained in the rules that severely impacted play, that really impacted setup and trying to figure out, what's going on. And they're basically one of the biggest problems, and I mentioned the hell out of this in the playthrough, the specific rules to the game. What they did was they took any rule that was modified, pretty much, cut and pasted it out of the basic standard rules, and then inserted the changes. So what you've got to do is you've got to read the standard rules, and then you've got to reread them here with their modifications, and you're left with this confusing. Much, much better to just give a list of, here are things that are different from the standard rules. Or print one rule book and just say, screw it, we're not going to sell this as a system with a coherent standard rule book. We're going to always merge the pieces together. All the stuff that wasn't taken from the Victory in the West system and the Sicily rules is really poorly written and really not well. It's not like huge grammatical errors or anything like that. By poorly written is, I mean, it's hard to follow these new rules. They're missing pieces. They're ambiguous. Sometimes whole rules are missing from where they belong. For example, the exiting the map rules. They're only present in one scenario, and even then in kind of an abortive form. If they hadn't been present in that one scenario, well, I would have, when I zoned out on the victory chart, said, which is of course not right the first thing I do in the game. I try to do some things at first, and then I started looking and I'm like, I would have been able to exit. Gosh, I should have known that right from the beginning. A game should really kind of express what the player's trying to do. Don't assume that you know the campaign, that the players know the campaign correctly, because there's idiots like me who do not. Especially when it comes, I'm going to say especially when it comes to World War II. But no, I'm just as clueless with everything. Okay, so my overall impression, here we go. The presentation here, there's dual map sizes, and that creates two terrain effects charts. That also caused me a little bit of mental distress. It was hard to keep, at least in my mind, track of two different sets of movement rates based on the different scales. Now, you have that same situation in World in Flames. I don't know why I found it harder here. I really don't have a good answer to that. I just did, and it may be the fact that they're right next to each other or whatever, and not compounded on the same level. I don't know. I don't know what happened, but I found that the presentation of that didn't work for me in terms of helping me remember which chart was which to use for a given thing. And that's clearly spelled out on it. It's not like it's that. It's just like, I don't know why I was failing. But early on in the game, I was using the wrong movement rates at the wrong place. Just because I would say, oh, where's the movement chart? And I would find a movement chart. And they're both right next to each other. I don't know, again, I don't know why I had a problem with this, but I would find one and use it and then be like, wow, things don't move very fast. There were some nice things in this, like the disengagement cost. I think that got rid of a really unrealistic thing that happened in Victory in the West, which is you're next to an enemy unit and you whip around and hit it from somewhere else. Able to surround units and everything like that very easily just because there was no cost for disengagement. Of course, maybe I missed that in the Victory in the West games. I'm not sure. Thought I looked for it. I'm not going to go. My overall assessment for this sucker is if you haven't played Victory in the West games, I probably wouldn't go for this. It's going to be hard to figure out, even if you have. The rules are just such a mess. If you have played them and you like them already, this might be an interesting project for you to, pick up and try to figure out how to set the game up and play it like I did. The extra 5 pages of 5 pages out of how big was this? Let me get rid of those. 5 pages out of about 15 pages of the exclusive rules, which that 15 pages of exclusive rules is larger, I think. Yep. This is only 10 pages of rules. The exclusive rules are 15 pages. The extra 5 pages, or the 5 pages of additional information is basically because the reason there's 10 more pages, or that there's more pages to the exclusive rules is most of this is copied in there. At least a very high proportion of it. And then you look, okay, so there's 5 extra pages kind of in the exclusive rules. There's actually more than that, but okay. And there's 5 pages of errata on those 5 extra pages. I mean, it's that bad. And the errata is not present in little simple snippets like, oh, this should be replaced as this, like SPI used to do, whatever, because there'd be a typo or something would just be flat out wrong or whatever. No, there's fairly long discussion in it, and I just couldn't face it after facing the rule book already. I was looking for errata, didn't find the errata. What I found was 5 pages of questions and answers. And I could not bear it. And maybe the answer to my, victory point questions would be in there. Anyway, if you do have Victory in the West, like Victory in the West, and are willing to put some effort into this, you get a different circumstance, a different situation. I still think that the transit boxes probably screw things up enough that it's not. It's gonna gnaw on your sensibilities as you play it. Certainly, if you're me, it will. On the bright side, there are a few different scenarios for this. That's something kind of better than what the Victory in the West does. There's a training scenario, but there's basically 3 variable scenarios, modifications to the campaign. What there isn't is the variable campaign game, which is referenced in the rules. I'm guessing that was removed, which would have involved different landings, probably on the other side, whatever. Who knows? So anyway, it's really not something I can recommend to most people. It's got a fairly high rating, which surprises the shit out of me. I can't believe that anybody looked at this, played it, bought the game, played it without being in constant contact with like the designer and was able to enjoy it. I find that very, very hard to believe, but you know, such is. It may be mainly being rated by people who were in the playtesting team. I got no idea. Anyway, it's interesting, but it wasn't ready for prime time, and it probably never will be.